Hey everyone, welcome back to K-Korner, the channel where we dive into the wild world of entitled people and their unbelievable stories. Hope you enjoy it, and without further ado, let's go. This just happened. I'm still sitting at the lobby in awe of the event, and I wanted to write it down while it's still fresh in my mind. I'm waiting for a ride home, so I got to witness a majority. For blood work at this particular medical center, there's a digital kiosk to sign in rather than speaking to a desk. The kiosk is very simple. Put your ID and insurance card in the machine. It'll scan, check you have a blood work request, then confirm it to the room in the back. While I was waiting, an older woman comes up to the front and entirely passes the kiosk and attempts to open the door into the lab. The door, not locked, is opened, and nurses quickly rush up to stop her, leading to an argument in the lobby with around 3 nurses blocking the door. Nurse 1, ma'am, you need to check in and wait to be called. Woman, I'm not doing that shit. You can't pay me to touch a damn computer. I don't even have an ID. You can look up my information in the back. Nurse 2, it doesn't work like that here. The kiosk is very simple. You can manually put in your information if you don't have an ID. Woman, I'm not doing that. This is unnecessary. The office in other town over doesn't have one. It's hard enough to put a card in the grocery store machine. Now you're making me do it here. Nurse 2, we're at that other location. I'm sorry, but we need you to check in. I can help if you need. Woman, this is ridiculous. Just look up my information. I'm an old woman. I won't touch a computer. I don't touch a computer anywhere. You can't force me. Nurse 2, ma'am, we're not forcing you. It's just how our system works. I can do it for you if you have your information. Woman, fine. Do it then. From there, she proceeds to announce her personal information very loudly. Nurse inputs it. Nurse 2, do you have an insurance card? Woman, obviously. I don't have it on me. You can look it up. Nurse 2, unfortunately, I can't. Our system doesn't work that way. Do you know your insurance ID? Woman, yeah, it's number. Nurse 2, there you're checked in. No problems. Woman, finally, I don't understand why this new generation is making everything so difficult. You can't expect me to use a computer. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone I know or any of these people behind me. For a 110, I'd give it a 0. Nurse 2, I understand, ma'am. You're signed in thought. You can take a seat now. Woman, I can't go back. I just went through all that trouble to sign in. I'm an old woman. This is already stressful. Nurse 1, there's someone in the back already. You'll be called in soon. Woman, I'll make sure to never come to this location again. Hurry it up then. The nurses went into the back and she took a seat somewhat close to me and began talking to the other people in the lobby. Only one other person engaged her, and she started talking about pancakes like she didn't cause a spectacle just now. Is this what second-hand embarrassment is? When she was called, she left her pile of belongings on a chair and went to the back. Edit. I didn't expect this would get so much attention. I'm fascinated by everyone's stories about technology and the older people giving their insight. Thank you for sharing. I didn't think it would become a post about technology, though. The response to technology wasn't the problem for me that made her entitled. It was her deliberate attempt to enter the blood work lab, then verbally snapping at the nurses that were trying to help her even after being offered for someone to check in for her. There was a button next to the kiosk that she could tap and it would call for help. She didn't do that. She ignored it altogether, then got angry at the nurses when she didn't get her way rather than asking for help at all. That's what this was meant to be about, not older people and technology. That being said, the comments are sharing some very amazing stories and information, and I recommend reading them. This happened last year. I, female 31, was 1 week away from my due date and was working full-time in a school administration position. At this time, I had the capability to work from home if needed X. Too sick to come into work, catch up on extra work, unable to secure daycare for my child, etc. When I accepted the position, prior to my pregnancy, I was told by my boss, let's call her Ronnie, that it was very flexible as long as I got my hours in. I very rarely worked from home and typically only did so for an hour or two in the morning if it was needed later on in order to work before Obgyn appointments, as it was a long commute between work and home to office. However, I was told by Ronnie after accepting the position to try and limit weight up to 2 days a month, which fine. At this point, I was well under since I was only working an hour or two, maybe twice a month, and only once a month before that. Being so close to my due date, I was experiencing physical hardships that made working on site more and more difficult, such as dizzy spells, a pulled tendon in my foot, and severe back pain. I was also scared of potentially going into labor while at work with it being so far away from the hospital my Obgyn delivers at. To top it all off, my coworkers started asking more invasive questions about my pregnancy that made me uncomfortable. All in all, it was not a fun time. I explained all of this in an email to Ronnie and asked for her permission to almost exclusively work from home up until I go into labor. I said I thought it would be a reasonable accommodation and I work really well from home. Ronnie responded a couple days later denying my request to work from home at all and said I needed to be there since we would be starting some of our busiest work in a couple months, which I would be gone for on maternity leave anyway, so I'm not sure why she brought it up. But I could talk to her about leave options if I am truly having trouble working. By the way, it is illegal in my state to require an employee to take leave if there is a reasonable accommodation that can be made instead. Cue malicious compliance. I immediately went to her and did just that. We talked about options and found out I could start my leave the very next day and still be paid state mandatory leave pay for the extra time. I informed Ronnie that I would be out starting the next day as I needed to take care of myself. She said, "I understand you need to do what's best for you, but you need to understand that I need to do what's best for the team." So, yeah, everything I normally manage basically went to crap in my absence as the other people on the team weren't qualified to do the work, and kept taking time off leading up to my due date instead of learning the basics while I was still there to teach them. I left detailed procedure notes and workflow lists, but I later found out Ronnie had to pick up all the extra work, and a lot of it never got done since she didn't have time. Enjoying the stories yet? If you do, please subscribe, like, and comment. I've always thought I didn't have any stories about entitled people to post here to be interesting enough, and read the most absurd reactions of entitled people and could not conceive it was possible until it happened to me. I think this story fits here, but if it doesn't, please accept my apologies. So for context, I'm a lab technician and work on the diagnosis laboratory of a big hospital from my country. I got my job here on the end of 2020 when they put up a facility on my city's international airport. Since COVID testing was needed for travel, and they thought it would be a good idea to offer a service for travelers that needed a negative report for COVID in order to travel that could be collected right there and released in a couple of hours faster than you could in any other healthcare facility, as we were there specifically for this only. Although when word got out, people went there just to be tested, as we did a pretty good job on releasing results within an hour or so, opposed to hospitals which were packed at that time still. I worked at the night shift, which was full of work until about midnight, and movement would fall as the last flight left at about 3 a.m., and then we would be pretty much free to do whatever we wanted. Usually there wasn't much to do. Since the machine did pretty much all the work, negative results would be automatically released, while the positive ones we needed to check if they were within acceptable range, meaning safe enough so people wouldn't be transmitting COVID, and passengers could either request for a printed report or pick it up on the hospital's app. For those of you who aren't familiar to real-time PCR testing, basically the machine does cycles in order to duplicate the amount of genetic material in the analyzed sample. It does so by having a fluorescent probe that is released after a certain gene is duplicated, and it can be picked up by the sensors after a certain threshold, hence the name cycle threshold, or CT for short, which is the amount of cycles that the machine needed to detect a certain portion of genes is present in a given sample. It's a bit more complex than that, but I think it's enough so you all can understand what a low CT, less cycles, more positive, and a high CT, more cycles, less positive means. What about negative samples? Well, the machine does a maximum of 45 cycles per sample. So if it doesn't duplicate by then, you're good to go, and this takes about an hour and a half to be completed, so it's pretty fast. In case it was positive, the machine released the results in about 20 minutes, as it didn't need the full cycles to detect the virus genetic material. We also offered the antigen quick tests, which I guess most people are familiar with now. It's less sensitive than the PCR testing, meaning if you come out as positive with it, You're basically a walking virus incubator. This one takes about 15 minutes to be done, or less if you're really positive, as the strip gets read immediately if you're really sick. If you're self-testing and it gets read immediately, you don't have to wait. You pretty much have COVID. But we left it for the full 15 minutes since that's what the manufacturer recommends before releasing the result. Now, for the story, I think this happened in the beginning of 2020, when the U.S. borders opened up for traveling again, and it was packed most of the days as lots of people rescheduled their trips to Disneyland mostly. It's pretty much everyone's dream here, to that period. We were used to the people from front desk coming over to the lab and ask us to prioritize certain individuals. Some were Karens, some were genuinely desperate, or some of them invented a sob story about, "We're going to our honeymoon," etc. And although they should not come a lab with possible COVID-positive samples, it didn't stop them. I used to joke to them, well, if they want their tests to come out positive, positives come out in about 20 minutes. Or would the passenger want some extra fries with that, and whatnot. Sometimes when it was packed, we couldn't process more than 48 samples per round, since this was all the machine could receive and PCRs would take up to 2 hours. We advertised the test to be released in up to 3 hours, but it rarely came to that, unless we needed to repeat someone's test. Enter our Karen. It was a packed day Tuesday, when the flights are cheaper for some reason, and people were nuts as the lines for testing were spiraling around the departure terminal. I arrived at 7 p.m. to start my shift, met my friend outside as we smoked before entering, and saw that huge line seeing we would have a busy day, and little did we know what was about to unfold. The day shift passed to us that there was a passenger who was ballistic waiting for hers and her family quick tests, since she had already rescheduled this trip 3 weeks and blah blah blah. I put on my protective gear and processed her sample, as it's pretty simple to do, and lo and behold, it was an instant positive while her families were all negative. I called my shift partner and we looked to each other with that "oh shit" face as someone from the front desk. Let's call her Amanda, who I had great friendship with, by the way, asked if it was ready, as the woman was already starting to get annoyed. It had passed exactly 5 minutes since they collected and our sample was in our lab. Me: well, we might have a problem. Oh. Why? I picked up Kay's strip and asked Amanda to take a look, and I could see her expression changing. A: is that Kay's test? Me: yep. A: and that's a quick test and it's positive. Seemed to me she was in denial or something. Me: yep. A: what should I do? What about the family? Me: looks like they're going to be negative and hers is positive. Well, there's nothing we can do, darling. A: can't you retest it? I was already getting annoyed myself at this point, as it was packed and there were lots of other samples to process. Me: we could, but it would be a waste to do so. But it could come out negative, couldn't it? I put my hands together, took a deep breath, and responded, Amanda, darling, she could be Mother Teresa or Obama and I would still release a positive result. There's nothing we can do. And with this result, it would be pretty much negligent and insensitive from our part to the world situation. Just remember to stay away from her while talking to her. Just for context, sometimes the strip gets a really faded red result, which by the kit manufacturer's instructions, it is still a positive, but we repeated those tests on the same sample to see if it happens again, and we released the second result as it may or may not come out positive. I know it's wrong, Imho, but our hospital's doctor said it was okay, so we went with our orders. She shrugged, accepted her fate, and left. I released the positive result, and as expected, a minute goes by and let's call him Bill enters the lab, with me already knowing what this is about. EUPA is going ballistic outside, saying it's impossible for her to be positive while her family is negative, and she's visiting her father regularly and he has cancer. She's demanding we release her a negative report. Me: we cannot do that, you know that? D: can't you retest it so it might come out negative? I explained to him, again, why that wasn't going to happen, but I said we could offer her and the family a free PCR test, which would take longer, was more expensive, but that it would definitely come out positive for her anyways. I did that as it happened quite frequently, and it was merely to protect ourselves legally in case someone sued the hospital. Most of the time they did sue, as I found out through my boss later, as PCR is a more sensitive test and the gold standard when it comes to COVID. He said okay and called in saying Kay was annoyed, but accepted the free PCR and demanded it was released fast. I called my boss at this point to give him the heads up, but that would impact the rest of the passengers' tests since we would have to use 4 spaces in the machine for her family alone. He understood and gave me the green light. Well, as I explained at the beginning of the post, EK's test took about 20 minutes to be analyzed by the machine. Her CT was 12. It was probably the record for lowest kept we'd ever have at that place. And 20 minutes later, her husband would come out as 28, and their kids would be 30-ish. Like I said, quick tests regularly wouldn't detect lower viral burdens, but 30-ish would be acceptable for traveling according to the hospital's doctors. So, basically, either the kids and HB were getting better and passed it to K, or K passed to the rest of the family and were getting sicker. This is why some of the countries made obligatory testing when travelers arrived at their final locations. Since in the airport with no clinical history, we cannot attest if it is the initial or final phase, and in some hours until the arrival, the viral burden may increase or decrease. So basically, I had to release her and hubby as positives and the kids were negative. You think a normal person would simply accept and leave, but not a K. 2 minutes go by and enters sobbing in the lab. Me. What happened? Explained to me while sobbing hard. She's a fluffy and soft cotton candy, you see. Anything gets her crying. That Key was throwing a tantrum, calling her names, the drill, and asked me if any of us could go out there and try to reason with her. Even though you can't argue with these people, and all of my cells were telling me not to, I went out as I can't stand seeing a friend crying because of some K, put on my white coat and see this woman screaming and cursing. As I was already rolling my eyes and shaking my head, but little did I know. I maintained my distance since I knew she was positive and started speaking. Me. Mrs. K. K. Finally, someone with a white coat. Can't you tell to these morons that this test is wrong and your hospital is forcibly making us good citizens lose our dreams? All of this while getting uncomfortably close to me while I try to take a few steps back. Shh. Yeah, you're ruining the vacation for us and our kids. We demand that you correct your results. Me. Sir, I can't. HB. Redo it now. You only want to make us pay money to redo these tests? K. Yes, you only want our money and are bitter because we can travel and you don't. Me. We offered you a free PCR. We retested you already. K. See, disgraceful. You Chinese think you're so much smarter than us. In my country, people have this horrible habit to call Asians either Chinese or Japanese, because that's all there is in East Asia for them. Me trying to maintain calm. I didn't say anything. The machine tested you and you're positive. Shpo. How come our kids aren't positive? This is impossible. Me. Sir, your kids might have it. They could have gotten from you or the other way around. I'm not allowed to say the exact CT to them. According to the hospital's policy, only the physicians in U.S. from the lab have access to that. K. Don't you dare say my kids or me are responsible for this. Me. I'm not. The virus is responsible for this. K. No, you're all inventing this virus to ruin our economy while we hard workers are trying to fix it up. We don't have any symptoms. I visited my father recently who's cancer and he didn't get it. Me. Ma'am, you know that's not how it works. K. Are you calling me stupid? In my head, yes. Me. No, ma'am, K. Then give me my negative test. Me. I can't. You both have already been reported to the health surveillance and your passport's banned for 10 days from traveling. Shbab, you did what? Undo it now. We're doing our test somewhere else and you'll be sorry we will sue you. Me. Sir, I don't have that pow. K. You're a disgrace to this country. You people should have been razed to the ground by the U.S., then you wouldn't have invented this virus to the world up to earn money on expense of us Westerners. Me. Excuse me? K. You heard me. And then K spit right on my face and eyes. Me. What the heck? K. Now here's your virus. Enjoy it. I stood there motionless processing what had just happened. HB, go back to your filthy continent. By this point, security showed up and escorted them to the HE's office. I cleared myself and continued working for the rest of the night as COVID takes a few days anyways to show up and be transmittable, and kept testing myself after a few days to see if I started getting sick, and I ended up being asymptomatic. After this episode, my boss ordered that none of us from the lab got out. He was worried people would follow us to the parking lot and do these kind of things. I got myself 15 days at home and this story, but the second time I contracted it would be much worse. That's a story for another time. Here's part 2. If you want to know what happened in part 1, check the last story in the previous video. When Grandpa was told about the situation, he immediately brushed it off. When Dad expressed his hurt over having his children and late wife insulted at his mother's funeral, the following exchange occurred. Grandpa, don't be daft. Dad, this is exactly what I'm talking about. I tell you about something utterly appalling, and you don't take my side. You just tell me not to be daft. Grandpa, shouting? I said she was daft. Gaslighting. It's one of Grandpa's favorite techniques. To lie, deny the past, and cover up, which has profoundly affected Dad, making him panic and doubt himself. As Dad was the one being gaslit, he struggled to see it himself. I could instantly see the worry, doubt, and confusion on his face. This enraged me, as I loved Dad more than anything in this world and hated seeing him emotionally abused right in front of me. Straight away, I called Grandpa out on his beat. I told him that he definitely did not say she, Mary, was daft. He did, in fact, call my father daft, and that what he was doing was an emotional abuse tactic known as gaslighting. Of course, Grandpa's response was to shout back non-responses. Give over! Oh, stop it! Shut up, just drop it! Stop being stupid, or now listen! Followed by an irrelevant story! We left with Dad feeling rotten that Grandpa missed his chance to do something right, but feeling better that someone was on his side and could point out exactly what was happening. Emotional abuse sows seeds of self-doubt, so it's difficult, if not impossible, to call it out on your own. We asked Grandpa to talk to Mary as we no longer wanted anything to do with her, especially since she was his niece, and he had regular phone contact with Deirdre, Mary's mother and Grandpa's sister. At first he said he would. Then he said he did, but only after receiving a phone call from Mary did we realize that, no, he hadn't told her at all. She conveniently forgot about it, then started to harass Dad over the phone, stopping only once we unplugged the phone. Nevertheless, we hoped to move on despite the situation, believing that while we couldn't get through to Grandpa, at least we let him know what happened and express the deep hurt it caused. Grandpa, being manipulative and stubborn, didn't want to let this drop. Rather than accepting that we no longer wanted anything to do with Mary, he continuously tried to subtly bring her up in conversations. First, he would bring her up directly, saying, Mary is ever so good to Deirdre, you know. We told him that after the hurt she caused, we did not want anything to do with her, and would appreciate it if he did not bring her up again. Then he tried more subtle ways. He would read out a card he received, prompt us into agreeing that the card was lovely, saying, Oh, isn't that a nice message? Only to then reveal that the card was from Mary. He would also frequently bring up Deirdre, followed by comments like, well, she's lucky she has Mary. Mary does take such good care of her, or good thing for Mary, huh? Before this incident, while he would talk about family members now and then, he definitely didn't talk about Mary anywhere near as much as he did after the incident. His actions showed that he was more concerned with manipulating Dad into having a positive opinion of Mary and whitewashing. The incident is nothing, even though Dad didn't have a high opinion of Mary due to the previous years of bullying. This happened multiple times, with Dad making it very clear that he was uncomfortable with ever having anything to do with Mary. What she said, along with the timing, was absolutely disgusting. Despite this, over a few months, Grandpa kept finding subtle ways to bring her up and try to put a rose-tinted view on her. Targument. At the end of November, early December, Dad went up for a visit while I was at work. When we met up again, Dad told me it was a damn disaster. Already, I was expecting the worst due to Grandpa's terrible track record. When Dad visited, Grandpa brought out a picture of Grandma's gravestone. He talked about how well-tended the grave was, how the headstone was clean and flowers had been put there. He encouraged Dad to agree that it was lovely before dropping the bombshell that it was Mary who had tended to Grandma's grave. Due to Mary's unkind and selfish nature, we're sure she's only doing this in hopes of being in Grandpa's will, but this is only speculation. Straight away, Dad pointed out that he was worried this would happen and that he was really upset, angry, and hurt that his father would bring up someone he knew caused a lot of pain to our side of the family. After making it clear that he was sick of having this bully brought up time and time again, especially after making it clear that he didn't want anything to do with her and that this fracture couldn't be mended, Grandpa came out with the following. I don't remember any of that. I mentioned that this was definitely an abuse tactic. he was just pretending not to remember in order to get away with bringing her up again despite being told many times not to. Dad said that to him. It didn't matter whether it was a lie, which it definitely was given Grandpa's history of constant lies, or whether he forgot, because forgetting something that important would prove he doesn't care. Just to make it clear, although he's now in his late 80s, Grandpa doesn't have any issues with his memory. He was always crap at remembering birthdays, but never anything this significant. The issue is he brought her up despite knowing that doing so causes pain. There was a minor argument then, not the argument in question, where Grandpa tried to brush it off as nothing big, and Dad told him that this was it. There would be absolutely no mention of Mary from now on. He wasn't going to tolerate it anymore. We wanted nothing to do with her, and Grandpa had to accept that he couldn't change our minds. This small argument really affected Dad. Over the next couple of weeks, he was in a very low mood. A lot of bad memories from his past were brought up involving the bullying, the rejection, and everything else he was put through as a child. As a son who loves his father a lot, I struggled to see Dad hurting so much. Due to Grandpa's actions, I was a little nervous when we made the trip up to see him on Sunday. Every year just before Christmas, we go up to exchange gifts with Grandpa, as well as Dad's brother and his family. This year, and last year, it was just us visiting him. Surprisingly, the visit started off relatively well. We dropped off the presents. Grandpa asked me about work, and we chatted about what we had been up to in our free time. It was all going as amicably as possible. Of course, Grandpa came out with his usual disapproval of modern times, complaining that nobody dances on Strictly Come Dancing anymore, and that they're all just jigging about, but it isn't anything other than what we would expect from someone who refuses to have an internet connection in his house, because he thinks the Chinese will empty his bank account, all because of some incident when he was a bank manager in the 80s. We had been there for a few hours, so it was starting to wind down. Like many situations, all was well until I went to the toilet. I excused myself to pop to the loo, and as I was washing my hands, I heard shouting, mainly my dad shouting. I was worried something like this would happen. "I can't trust you at all with anything." I stepped out of the bathroom, and Dad beckoned me into the kitchen where he told me exactly what was said. While I was in the loo, Grandpa mentioned he'd heard from some family members, namely the one cousin that Dad actually gets along with. Dad was relatively comfortable with the conversation, as there had been no reference to Mary until Grandpa said the following: "I don't think there are any members of our family I don't get along with. Don't you?" That was when Dad reached his breaking point, saying that it was all going well right up until Grandpa sneakily said that. Grandpa was aware that I had been helping Dad through his emotional abuse, and that I was the one to help him understand how serious it was, so he had deliberately waited until I was out of the room for a few minutes to bring it up. Dad said he wouldn't have minded if Grandpa had said that he got on with everyone and left it at that. It was the fact that saying, "Don't you," pigeonholed Dad into either blindly agreeing with him, which I'm sure was what Grandpa wanted as he's always forcing his opinion on everyone, or forcing Dad to say, "No, I don't get along with Mary," which would have brought her up. After Dad brought me up to speed, I walked through into the living room where Grandpa was shouting that he never brought Mary up in the conversation. I pointed out that he definitely did, which was when he started arguing that he never mentioned her by name. And it was Dad who decided it was all about her, and that I just said how I felt about the family. I never asked the Dad what he thought because I know. What Dad did next made me very proud. He straight up called Grandpa out on his emotional abuse, specifically his gaslighting. He reiterated that Grandpa said the family, which Mary is a part of, and the fact that he tried to force Dad to agree, then the fact that he covered up what he said with lies. He even said the phrase, "It's emotional abuse and it's called gaslighting," which made me really proud. I've seen all the effects this abuse has had on Dad and the continuing effects it still has, so the fact that he didn't accept any of the nonsense coming out of Grandpa's mouth was fantastic. Of course, I was there to back him up, which he said meant a lot, as previously in his life it had been him alone against family bullies, but he managed to stand up for himself against his abuser. It all then came out, with Dad saying this was another case of him never taking his side, how he had told people about Mary's behavior, and they had all agreed that it was absolutely appalling and disgusting, and that any good father would agree you shouldn't mock his son's children and late wife at his mother's funeral. Grandpa kept arguing that it should be dropped because there's nothing I can do now, and it doesn't matter what I do. We tried to say that yes, he can do something. He can take our side for once or at least not mention Mary when he knows the pain it causes. Dad said that he keeps mentioning her deliberately, knowing it would cause us pain. He said he didn't deliberately try and cause pain, To which I replied that if he said something, knowing it would hurt us emotionally, even if that wasn't his intention, then that was as bad as doing it intentionally. Then Dad walked out to calm down, and I decided to try and appeal to Grandpa's, evidently very small, sense of compassion and empathy. It was frustrating, as Grandpa kept trying to shout over me, doing everything he could to simply shut down the conversation. Nevertheless, I tried. I said that I really wanted the family to heal, and that we wanted to move forward, and that this was something Dad wanted too, as he wouldn't keep visiting if he didn't care about his father. I really hoped that perhaps if Grandpa could understand why Mary's joke hurt as much as it did, then perhaps he would understand why we wanted nothing to do with her. I started to talk frankly to Grandpa, saying that it hurt a great deal that she insulted my mother. Remember previously when I mentioned he had screamed at me, "How would you like it if I insulted your mother?" Then didn't seem to have an issue with Mary doing it. So I tried to get him to empathize with the pain I went through of losing my mother, only to have someone make the joke she did, which quite literally adds insult to injury. I looked him in the eyes and spoke seriously. "Me, Grandpa, I lost Mom 5 days after my 12th birthday. It was utterly devastating to lose my mother at such a young age. I have had to see therapists, other mental health professionals as, Grandpa, I lost my wife." That's right, reader. My grandfather compared me, losing my mother as a 12-year-old after she had been diagnosed with cancer when I was 9 years old. So when 4 of my time with her was spent in and out of hospital, worrying how I might be losing her, to him losing his wife when she was 86 and he was 84. So rather than seeing it as me trying to get him to empathize with our situation, he just saw it as a competition for who had suffered the most. That was when Dad snapped and actually shouted at Grandpa. I did point out later on that I noticed Dad only got this level of furious shouting, angry once Grandpa wronged me, rather than when he wronged himself, which I feel proves that he always puts me and my brother before himself. He came through, shouting, "How dare you? How dare you make such a comparison?" It's nowhere near the same. Dad laid it on thick, but I have to say everything he said was completely valid. He shouted that Grandpa was fundamentally dishonest, emotionally abusive, and disgustingly selfish. He said this was another case of Grandpa thinking about himself and never actually caring about his kids, and subsequent grandkids, as he should. Dad also said that he loved his children so much, and actually becoming a father means he doesn't understand at all emotionally how Grandpa can be so heartless when all that matters to Dad is the happiness of his kids. Dad also mentioned that while he also lost his wife, it wouldn't have been a fair comparison either, as Dad lost Mom to cancer when they were in their early 40s, whereas Grandpa lost Grandma when they were in their mid-80s, which, rather than being tragically early, is a natural part of life and to be expected. But the fact that he dared to compare it to my grief as a child was precisely what made it so much worse. Dad's main points were to do with the abuse he suffered. That he suffered greatly due to this rejection he kept going through over and over again based on not being from Yorkshire. That other family members have been allowed to abuse him because they're from Yorkshire, and he's not, that even now he cares more about his niece being able to make disgusting jabs at our side of the family more than his own son being insulted at a funeral. A few other dynamics in the family were mentioned, but it would be going too off topic to list them now. Nevertheless, there was a lot of hypocrisy from the abusive side of the family. During this argument, Grandpa deflected as much as he could, saying the following classic lines: "All you're doing is shouting at me. It doesn't matter what I do, does it?" You'll just disagree. Well, I think that's the end of this visit then. Stop shouting. Just get out. No matter what I do, you'll just shout at me. All you ever do is shout at me. Don't be stupid. Oh, just shut up. Shut up. To note, Grandpa in his old age has become relatively deaf and refuses to acknowledge it, so a lot of the time shouting is necessary just so he can hear us. When being aggressive and shouting didn't work, he started to pretend to flinch and cower as if we were going to hit him. It's worth mentioning that Dad and I have never been violent, but Grandpa did regularly beat Dad when he was a child. Nevertheless, he tried to cower, whimpering and covering his face, then trying to complain that he was in too much pain from his arthritis. Dad pointed at Grandpa's hand and said, "This is karma. You are suffering all the pain that you have given many other people." Dad later told me that he felt really guilty about saying this, and that a great deal of him wishes he hadn't. To be completely honest, I think it was more than fair enough. Dad has suffered so much due to the ongoing emotional abuse he's been through at the hands of Grandpa, not just from him instigating it, but him allowing and encouraging others to bully his own son. He also caused pain to many other people, those that he managed as a bank manager, my grandma as well as his ex-wife from before her, other family members, colleagues, and friends. He's been a horrible person to so many people that Dad has said a few times that one of the ways he copes with the pain he's been through is by thinking of Grandpa's suffering being karma. I know it's something he's thought about quite a bit, isn't something that he would just say to cause pain. Dad walked out of the house and my brother followed after, trying to check up on Dad as best he could. My brother is autistic and understands the kind of person Grandpa is. While he couldn't get involved in the argument, he showed real concern for Dad afterwards. As this happened, I turned to Grandpa and said that I have looked in your heart to see if there's any compassion, any empathy, and I can see that there is none. We left, and while the aftermath was incredibly difficult for Dad, he did say that he felt better after this visit where it all came off his chest, and with me backing him up, than it did the time before with Grandpa doing his classic emotionally abusive and gaslighting techniques while on his own. Dad normally phones him up after a visit to let him know he got home okay, as it is a 2-hour journey. I elected to phone Grandpa this time as I know it would be far too emotionally raw for Dad to do so. When I phoned, he acted like nothing had happened, asked about traffic, and left it at that. Dad also phoned up to wish Grandpa a happy birthday since, and similarly, he acted as if nothing happened. I wouldn't be surprised if he still tried to push the Mary issue later. Dad is doing his own therapeutic writing about the situation, which started before the big argument on Sunday. What he does with the writing afterward is up to him, but there may be updates on this story. Similarly, I might post a few others as this is now over 6.5K words and I've only touched on a part of it. And just in case anyone doubted the cruel, selfish nature that Mary had. I Googled her name since the argument and it turns out she's been done for sexual harassment and stalking an ex-colleague after they had an affair, while they were both married people. This was only uncovered after a culture of bullying and harassment was whistleblown at her workplace, where the sexual harassment and stalking then came to light. I think if you encourage a child to bully another child that's considerably younger, it naturally causes their sense of entitlement, superiority, and sadism to grow. It doesn't surprise me that she's a sex offender, although it does make me even more disgusted to be related to this woman. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more captivating stories. Share your own experiences, opinions in the comments below, and let's keep the conversation going. Until next time, stay tuned for more epic tales.